The most important secret of World War II wasn't kept by generals or politicians. It was kept by mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions working in a Victorian mansion in the English countryside. Their mission, to break the unbreakable Nazi code machine called Enigma. Their success would save millions of lives and shorten the war by years. But for decades, no one could know what they'd done. This is a story of how a Polish mathematician, a British genius, and thousands of brilliant minds working in absolute secrecy achieved what the Nazis believed was impossible. In 1918, as the First World War ended, a German engineer named Arthur Skerbius invented something revolutionary. He called it Enigma, and it looked like an oversized typewriter in a wooden box. When you press a key, an electrical signal ran through a series of rotating wheels called rotors, then bounced off a reflector and came back through the rotors by a different route, finally lighting up a letter on a lampboard. That letter was your encrypted output. The genius of Enigma was its rotors. Each time you press a key, at least one rotor advanced by one position, changing the entire encryption pathway. Press the letter A twice in a row, and you get two completely different encrypted letters. The same letter in your plain text message almost never encrypted to the same letter twice. But the real security came from the number of possible settings. An Enigma machine had 3 rotors that could be arranged in any order. Each rotor could start in any of 26 positions. There was also a plug board at the front that could swap pairs of letters before they even entered the rotors. When you calculated all the possible combinations, Enigma had more than 158 million possibilities. To the German military, this meant their communications were absolutely secure. To crack a message, you'd need to know which rotors were being used, in what order, with what starting positions, and which letters were swapped on the plug board. Without that information, you'd have to try every possible combination. Even if you could test 1 million settings per second, it would take thousands of years. The Germans were so confident in Enigma that they used it for everything. U-boats in the Atlantic received their hunting orders via Enigma. Panzer divisions coordinated their attacks with Enigma. The Luftwaffe directed bombing raids using Enigma. Field Marshal Rommel in North Africa, Admiral Donitz commanding the submarine fleet, generals on the Eastern Front. They all trusted Enigma with Germany's most vital secrets. They believed it was unbreakable. They were wrong. In 1918, as the First World War ended, a German engineer named Arthur Skerbius invented something revolutionary. He called it Enigma, and it looked like an oversized typewriter in a wooden box. When you press a key, an electrical signal ran through a series of rotating wheels called rotors, then bounced off a reflector and came back through the rotors by a different route, finally lighting up a letter on a lampboard. That letter was your encrypted output. The genius of Enigma was its rotors. Each time you press a key, at least one rotor advanced by one position, changing the entire encryption pathway. Press the letter A twice in a row, and you get 2 completely different encrypted letters. The same letter in your plain text message almost never encrypted to the same letter twice. But the real security came from the number of possible settings. An Enigma machine had 3 rotors that could be arranged in any order. Each rotor could start in any of 26 positions. There was also a plug board at the front that could swap pairs of letters before they even entered the rotors. When you calculated all the possible combinations, Enigma had more than 158 million possibilities. To the German military, this meant their communications were absolutely secure. To crack a message, you'd need to know which rotors were being used, in what order, with what starting positions, and which letters were swapped on the plug board. Without that information, you'd have to try every possible combination. Even if you could test 1 million settings per second, it would take thousands of years. The Germans were so confident in Enigma that they used it for everything. U-boats in the Atlantic received their hunting orders via Enigma. Panzer divisions coordinated their attacks with Enigma. The Luftwaffe directed bombing raids using Enigma. Field Marshal Rommel in North Africa, Admiral Donitz commanding the submarine fleet, generals on the Eastern Front. They all trusted Enigma with Germany's most vital secrets. They believed it was unbreakable. They were wrong. The bomber, named either after a type of ice cream or the ticking sound it made, was an electromechanical device that automated part of the code-breaking process. It had 6 Enigma machines wired together, all running simultaneously to test different rotor settings. When it found a match, it would stop, and the operators would know they'd found the right configuration. The Poles built 6 of these machines, and they worked beautifully. By 1939, Poland was reading German military communications regularly, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Germany were preparing for war, and German cryptographers were making Enigma more complex. In December 1938, the Germans added 2 more rotors to their rotor inventory, increasing the combinations exponentially. The Polish bomber machines, designed for 3 rotors chosen from 3, couldn't handle 5 possible rotors. Poland would need 60 bombers to cover all possibilities, and they didn't have the industrial capacity or the time. On July 25, 1939, 5 weeks before Germany invaded Poland, Rejewski and his colleagues made a desperate decision. They invited British and French intelligence officers to Warsaw and shared everything. They handed over their techniques, their replica Enigma machines, their rotor wirings, their bomber designs. Everything they'd learned in 7 years of brilliant mathematical cryptanalysis, they gave away freely. The British officers were stunned. They'd spent years getting nowhere with Enigma. Now the Poles were handing them the key. Commander Alistair Denison, head of Britain's government code and cipher school, received one of the replica Enigma machines. It was transported to Britain in a diplomatic bag through Romania and France. When war broke out on September 1st, 1939, the British Codebreakers inherited the Polish legacy. As for Rejewski and his team, they escaped through Romania just before Warsaw fell. They eventually reached France and continued their code-breaking work. When France fell in 1940, they fled again. Rejewski spent the rest of the war in exile, his greatest achievement unknown to the world. After the war, he returned to Poland and worked as an accountant. He couldn't tell anyone what he'd done. The Enigma secret remained classified, and Poland was behind the Iron Curtain. Rejewski lived in obscurity for decades. Only in the 1970s, when the Enigma story finally began to emerge, did the world learn that this quiet mathematician had been the first to crack the unbreakable code. Bletchley Park was never meant to be a spy headquarters. It was a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, about 50 miles north of London, built by a financier who wanted somewhere impressive to entertain. By the 1930s, it was looking for a buyer. The British Secret Intelligence Service found it perfect for their purposes. It was close enough to London for communications, but far enough away to escape bombing. It had good rail connections to Oxford and Cambridge, and it was unremarkable enough that hundreds of people could work there without attracting attention. In 1938, the Government Code and Cipher School held its first secret training session at Bletchley Park. When war broke out in September 1939, the entire operation moved there permanently. What started with about 150 people would eventually employ over 10,000. The early recruits were an unusual bunch. Britain's intelligence services realized that traditional military men weren't suited for this work. Code breaking required abstract thinking, pattern recognition, and the ability to obsess over tiny details for hours. So they recruited differently. They wanted mathematicians, obviously, but they also wanted linguists, classicists, chess champions, crossword enthusiasts, anyone who could solve complex puzzles. They approached academics at Oxford and Cambridge. They scouted winners of newspaper crossword competitions. The Daily Telegraph ran a crossword challenge. Solve this puzzle in under 12 minutes. And successful contestants received mysterious invitations. The recruits were told almost nothing. They signed the Official Secrets Act, agreeing to never discuss their work, not even with their families. Most had no idea what they'd be doing until they arrived. Some thought they'd be learning to spy. Instead, they found themselves in wooden huts, staring at columns of random letters, trying to find meaning in apparent chaos. Bletchley Park was organized into huts, each tackling different problems. Hut 6 worked on German Army and Air Force Enigma. Hut 8 focused on Naval Enigma, which was more complex. Hut 3 translated and analyzed the decrypted Army and Air Force messages. Hut 4 did the same for naval messages. There were huts for Italian codes, Japanese codes, administrative work, and construction of code-breaking machines. The conditions were far from glamorous. The huts were cold in winter, hot in summer, and cramped all year round. People worked 8-hour shifts around the clock, cycling through day shift, evening shift, and night shift. They worked Christmas, they worked their birthdays, they worked through air raids. The work was mentally exhausting, and the secrecy meant they couldn't even tell their families why they were so tired. But gradually, message by message, they began to break into German communications. Using the foundations laid by the Poles, Bletchley Park started reading Enigma traffic. Not all of it. Different parts of the German military used different Enigma settings, called keys, and each had to be broken separately, but enough to make a difference. The decrypted messages were called ultra-intelligence, and they were beyond valuable. They told British commanders where U-boats were hunting in the Atlantic. They revealed German troop positions in North Africa. They provided advance warning of Luftwaffe bombing raids. But using this intelligence was dangerously difficult. If the British acted too obviously on decrypted messages, the Germans would realize their codes were broken and would change their system. So Bletchley's intelligence could only be used carefully, often requiring cover stories to explain how the information was obtained. Still, by late 1939 and early 1940, Ultra were providing useful intelligence. But it wasn't enough. The Germans kept improving Enigma security, adding complications that multiplied the possible settings. The old methods were too slow. Testing settings manually or with basic machines took too long. By the time a message was decrypted, the information might be outdated. What Bletchley Park needed was something faster, more powerful, more automatic. They needed someone who could design a machine that thought differently. They needed Alan Turing. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park on September 4, 1939, the day after Britain declared war. He was 27 years old, already recognized as one of the most brilliant mathematical logicians of his generation, and almost completely unsuited for ordinary life. Turing was eccentric in ways that made him memorable. He cycled to work wearing a gas mask, not for protection but because it helped his hay fever. He chained his tea mug to a radiator so no one would steal it. He was socially awkward, often oblivious to hints and social cues. He dressed carelessly, spoke bluntly, and had little patience for hierarchy or bureaucracy. But his mind was extraordinary. In 1936, while still a graduate student at Cambridge, Turing had published a paper that would eventually be recognized as one of the most important in the history of computer science. It was about a theoretical machine, now called a Turing machine, that could perform any calculation that could be precisely defined. This was abstract mathematics, exploring the very nature of computation. But it meant Turing thought about problems in terms of mechanical processes, of machines that could automatically perform logical operations. This made him perfect for Bletchley Park. Turing was assigned to Hut 8, working on naval Enigma. This was considered the hardest Enigma variant because German naval operations depended on secure communications, so the Navy used additional security measures. They had more rotors to choose from and changed settings more frequently. Naval Enigma was also the most critical to break, because German U-boats were devastating British shipping. Britain imported much of its food and nearly all its oil. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. If the Atlantic supply lines were cut, Britain would starve. Turing's task was to find a way to break Naval Enigma quickly enough to matter. He approached it the way the Poles had, as a mathematical problem, not a linguistic puzzle. But Turing went further. He designed a machine that could automatically test thousands of possible Enigma settings. He called it the bomb, an homage to the Polish bomber but far more sophisticated. Turing's bomb was an electromechanical computer, over 6 feet tall and 7 feet wide, weighing more than a ton. It contained rotating drums that simulated dozens of Enigma machines running simultaneously. The front was covered with circular drums, each with the 26 letters of the alphabet around its edge, all rotating and clicking as electrical circuits tested logical chains. The bomb worked on a principle Turing developed called a crib. A crib was a guess about what might be in a message. For instance, many German weather reports ended with Heil Hitler. Many messages started with standard military phrasing. If you could guess even a few words of the plain text and you knew where in the message they appeared, you could use that as a starting point. The bomb would take a crib and test it against different Enigma settings. For each setting, it would follow the logical implications through chains of letters. If a setting led to a logical contradiction, if it implied that a letter had to be 2 different things at once, that setting was impossible, and the bomb would eliminate it and move on. When it found a setting that didn't produce contradictions, it would stop, and the operators would test that setting manually. The first bomb, called Victory, became operational in March 1940. It was slow and had problems, but it proved the concept worked. Turing and his colleague Gordon Welshman improved the design, adding a diagonal board that made it vastly more efficient. By August 1940, the improved bombers were breaking naval Enigma regularly. Britain began building bombers as fast as they could. Eventually, over 200 bombers were operating, mostly staffed by women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, called Wrens. The Wrens loaded the machines with the rotor settings to test, monitored them as they ran, and recorded the results. It was exhausting work. The machines were loud, the rooms were hot, and mistakes could waste hours. But the Wrens became expert at operating these extraordinary devices. With the bombers running day and night, Bletchley Park could decrypt German messages often within hours. Sometimes critical messages were decrypted and in the hands of British commanders, while the intended German recipients were still decoding them. But Turing wasn't satisfied. Naval Enigma still had periods where it went dark, when the Germans changed procedures or when cribs were hard to find. Turing developed other techniques, other ways to attack the problem. He was relentless, always thinking several steps ahead, always looking for weaknesses in the German system. His colleagues found him difficult to work with sometimes. He was impatient with slower thinkers, dismissive of bureaucracy, and often socially inappropriate. But everyone recognized his genius. Hugh Alexander, the British chess champion who worked alongside Turing, later said that Turing was the person who made the greatest contribution to breaking Enigma. While names like Turing and Rejewski became famous, thousands of people whose names we'll never know kept Bletchley Park running. About 3/4 of them were women, and many were doing far more than clerical work. The women of Bletchley Park came from all backgrounds. Some were debutantes from aristocratic families, recruited through personal connections. Others were working-class women from local towns, hired as the operation expanded. Many were students or recent graduates, their academic careers interrupted by war. They all had one thing in common. They were clever, and they could keep secrets. Some operated the bombers. This wasn't simple machine minding. Bomb operators needed to understand the logical principles behind what they were doing. They had to recognize when a machine was malfunctioning versus when it had found a genuine result. They worked in rotating shifts in hot, deafeningly loud rooms, maintaining concentration for hours while the machines clattered through millions of possibilities. Others worked as cryptanalysts, doing the actual code breaking. Joan Clark, for instance, was one of Turing's top team members in Hut 8. She was a brilliant mathematician from Cambridge, recruited through her academic work. She became deputy head of her section, one of the few women in a senior code-breaking role, though she was paid substantially less than men doing equivalent work. She and Turing were briefly engaged, though he broke it off after confessing his homosexuality. They remained close friends and colleagues throughout the war. Mavis Lever, another Cambridge graduate, worked on Italian codes and made several crucial breakthroughs. At age 19, she broke an Italian naval cipher that revealed the Italian fleet's plans before the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. British ships ambushed the Italian fleet at night, sinking several cruisers. Over 2,000 Italian sailors died, and only 3 British crew members were killed. The Italian Navy never recovered from the defeat, effectively ending their threat in the Mediterranean. Margaret Rock worked on Japanese codes. Roseanne Colchester worked on German police codes. Betty Webb tracked the ABWA, German military intelligence. And Williamson worked in the Numenry, the section developing the Colossus computer to break an even more complex cipher system than Enigma. Many of these women were doing work far beyond what society expected of women in the 1940s. But they couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't explain to their families why they'd left their homes, or why they looked exhausted, or why they sometimes flinched at loud noises after working night shifts in the bomb rooms. After the war, when they returned to civilian life, they couldn't put their Bletchley Park work on their resumes. They couldn't explain the gaps in their employment history. Some returned to secretarial work or teaching, their actual skills and accomplishments locked behind the Official Secrets Act. It would be decades before most could talk about what they'd done. By then, many had passed away, their contributions forgotten. The history of Bletchley Park is full of anonymous brilliance, of people who changed the course of the war and then went back to ordinary lives, never receiving recognition for their extraordinary achievements. The Battle of the Atlantic. By 1941, Bletchley Park was regularly breaking Army and Air Force Enigma, providing intelligence that helped British forces in North Africa, and warned of Luftwaffe attacks. But naval Enigma remained inconsistent. The German Navy was more security-conscious and frequently changed procedures. Weiss, in February 1942, German U-boats switched to a new Enigma system with 4 rotors instead of 3. The blackout was immediate and catastrophic. Suddenly, Bletchley Park couldn't read naval Enigma at all. The existing bombers couldn't handle the 4-rotor system. There were too many possible combinations. And U-boats, no longer being tracked, were sinking Allied ships at a terrifying rate. In November 1942, U-boats sank 117 ships. In the first 20 days of March 1943, they sank 97 ships. At that rate, Britain would run out of supplies within months. Merchant sailors died in freezing Atlantic waters. Fuel supplies dwindled. Food rationing grew more severe. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Bletchley Park worked frantically to break back into 4-rotor Enigma. They needed cribs, known plain text they could use to attack the cipher. But 4-rotor messages were harder to break, and cribs were difficult to find. Then came one of the war's most audacious operations. British intelligence learned that U-boats were being resupplied at sea by vessels called weather ships that transmitted weather reports using regular 3-rotor Enigma. If they could capture a weather ship and its cipher materials, they have cribs for the more secure 4-rotor system. In May 1941, the British Navy captured U-110 after damaging it in combat. Before the submarine sank, boarding party sees its Enigma machine and current settings. In February 1942, they captured U-559 in the Mediterranean. A young British sailor named Anthony Farson and able seaman Colin Grazier boarded the sinking submarine and handed out crucial documents before the submarine went down. They drowned in the attempt, but the materials they recovered helped Bletchley Park break back into naval Enigma. By December 1942, Bletchley Park was reading 4-rotor naval Enigma. The impact was immediate. Convoys could be routed around U-boat patrol lines. Allied warships could hunt U-boats more effectively. Merchant ship losses plummeted. In May 1943, U-boat losses became so severe that Admiral Donitz temporarily withdrew them from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic turned on intelligence. Bletchley Park couldn't sink U-boats directly, but by reading their orders and positions, they made the submarines findable. And once U-boats could be found, they could be destroyed. The intelligence from Bletchley Park saved countless lives. Every convoy that reached Britain safely, every merchant ship that wasn't torpedoed, every sailor who survived the war, many owed their survival to codebreakers they would never know existed. Enigma wasn't Germany's only cipher system. For the highest level communications, messages between Hitler and his generals, strategic directives from the German High Command, the Germans used an even more complex system. The British codenamed it Tunny. Tunny was based on a machine called the Lorenz cipher, which was far more complicated than Enigma. It used 12 rotors instead of 3 or 4, and its encryption patterns were vastly more complex. Breaking Tunny required a completely different approach. A linguist and codebreaker named Bill Tutt performed one of the most remarkable feats of intellectual achievement in the entire war. Working from intercepted messages alone, never having seen a Lorenz machine, Tutt deduced its entire logical structure. By analyzing patterns in the encrypted text, he figured out how the machine worked. It took months of intense analysis, but eventually Tutt wrote a complete description of a machine he'd never touched. But even knowing how Tunny worked didn't make breaking it easy. The number of possible settings was astronomical. What was needed was something unprecedented, an electronic computer that could analyze messages at high speed. Tommy Flowers, an engineer from the post office, designed and built it. He called it Colossus, and it was the world's first large-scale electronic computer. Colossus used 1,500 vacuum tubes and could perform complex logical operations electronically, far faster than any electromechanical device. The first Colossus became operational in February 1944, just in time to help with preparations for D-Day. Colossus allowed Bletchley Park to read the highest-level German communications. They learned about Hitler's strategic thinking, about German troop dispositions, about plans and fears at the very top of the Nazi command structure. This intelligence was so sensitive that only a handful of people even knew it existed. 10 Colossus machines were eventually built, each one an engineering marvel. After the war, 8 were destroyed, and the remaining 2 were dismantled. The Colossus project remained secret for decades. Tommy Flowers couldn't tell anyone about his groundbreaking work in computing. When the history of computers was written, Colossus wasn't mentioned, and American machines were credited as the first electronic computers. Only in the 1970s did the truth begin to emerge. By 1944, Bletchley Park was at peak efficiency. Thousands of people worked in shift around the clock. Hundreds of bombers clattered away. Colossus machines processed the highest level ciphers. Messages were being decrypted, translated, and analyzed, then rushed to commanders within hours. As the Allies planned the invasion of France, ultra-intelligence was critical. Bletchley Park read German assessments of where the invasion might come. They tracked German divisions and their locations. They monitored the effectiveness of Allied deception operations designed to make the Germans think the invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy. Most crucially, they confirmed that the deception was working. In the weeks after D-Day on June 6, 1944, decrypted messages showed that Hitler still believed the Normandy landings were a feint and that the real invasion would come at Calais. He kept powerful panzer divisions waiting in Calais while the Allies established their beachhead in Normandy. By the time Hitler realized his mistake, it was too late. Throughout the final year of the war, ultra-intelligence guided Allied operations. It revealed the location of German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. It tracked the movements of German units as they retreated across Europe. It provided insight into the state of German morale, supplies, and strategic thinking. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, later said that ultra-intelligence had been decisive in the Allied victory. Other military leaders estimated that Ultra had shortened the war by at least 2 years, possibly 4. If that's true, then Bletchley Park saved millions of lives. Soldiers who would have died in battles that never had to be fought, civilians who would have perished in bombings and starvation and Holocaust camps that operated for years longer. But the strangest part of Bletchley Park's achievement was that it had to remain secret. When the war ended in May 1945, everyone who'd worked there went home and couldn't tell their families what they'd done. The captured Enigma machines were destroyed or sent to British colonies, where they were used to secure communications. The local governments had no idea the British could read every message. The bombers were dismantled. Most of the Colossus machines were destroyed. Documents were burned or locked away. The few people who knew the full story realized that if the Enigma secret became public, other nations would strengthen their cipher systems. So the secret was kept. For 30 years, one of the greatest intelligence achievements in history remained classified. Alan Turing didn't get a comfortable retirement. After the war, he worked on early computer development, contributing to the Manchester computers that pioneered stored program computing. He wrote foundational papers on artificial intelligence, proposing what became known as the Turing test for machine intelligence. He worked on mathematical biology, developing equations that describe pattern formation in nature. But in 1952, Turing was prosecuted for homosexual acts, which were illegal in Britain at the time. Facing imprisonment, he accepted chemical castration as an alternative sentence. The hormone treatments caused severe side effects, including the development of breasts. He lost his security clearance. His brilliant mind continued working, but his body and spirit were breaking. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. A half-eaten apple was beside his bed, apparently laced with cyanide. The inquest ruled it suicide, though some believe it may have been an accidental poisoning from a chemistry experiment. He was 41 years old. Turing died unknown to the public, his greatest achievement still secret. When the history of World War II was written, Bletchley Park wasn't mentioned. When the history of computing was written, Turing's work on the bomb and his wartime computing innovations couldn't be discussed. The man who may have done more than anyone to defeat Nazi Germany, who laid foundations for modern computing, died in obscurity and disgrace. Marian Rejewski lived longer but in similar obscurity. After the war, he returned to communist Poland and worked as an accountant and factory manager. He couldn't discuss his cryptographic work because it remained classified by both the British and Polish governments. He lived quietly with his family, his mathematical genius unused, his extraordinary achievement unknown. In 1967, a Polish military historian began researching the history of Polish intelligence and tracked down Rejewski. For the first time since 1939, Rejewski could discuss what he'd done. He wrote memoirs describing the Polish breakthrough. When these were published in the West in the early 1970s, they caused a sensation. The story of Enigma, long believed to be purely a British achievement, turned out to have begun in Poland. The full Bletchley Park story began emerging around the same time. In 1974, a book called The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham revealed the existence of the Ultra Intelligence Program. More books followed. Former Bletchley Park workers, finally released from their secrecy oaths, began sharing their experiences. The Enigma secret, held for 3 decades, finally came out. The revelations forced a reassessment of World War II history. Suddenly, puzzling decisions made sense. Allied commanders had sometimes made choices that seemed militarily inexplicable but were perfectly logical if you knew they'd read the German orders. The British victory at the Battle of Cape Matapan, the Allied success in the Battle of the Atlantic, the effectiveness of D-Day deceptions, all were now understood to have been guided by decrypted intelligence. Today, Bletchley Park is a museum. You can walk through the restored huts where the Codebreakers worked. You can see a rebuilt bomb, its drums rotating as it would have during the war. You can visit the mansion where the first small team gathered in 1939, unaware that their operation would grow to over 10,000 people. Alan Turing is now recognized as one of the most important figures in computing history. The Turing Award, computing's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, is named for him. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a posthumous pardon for his criminal conviction. In 2019, Turing was selected to appear on Britain's £50 note. His work on artificial intelligence, mathematical biology, and computing is studied worldwide. Marian Rejewski received recognition late in life. In 1978, he was awarded Poland's highest military decoration. He died in 1980 at age 74, finally acknowledged as a pioneer of modern cryptanalysis. A monument to Rejewski and his colleague stands in Poznan, honoring their crucial first breakthrough. The women of Bletchley Park have been slower to receive recognition, partly because many died before they could discuss their work, and partly because historical accounts initially focused on the famous male cryptanalysts. But recent years have seen efforts to honor their contributions. Documentaries, books, and museum exhibits now tell their stories. In 2009, the British government issued a formal apology to all Bletchley Park veterans for the decades of enforced secrecy that prevented them from receiving recognition. The technical legacy of Bletchley Park is profound. The bomb machines were electromechanical computers designed to perform logical operations automatically. Colossus was an electronic computer, programmable for different tasks. The code breakers at Bletchley Park weren't just breaking codes. They were inventing the foundations of computer science. The concept developed there, automated logical processing, electronic computing, algorithmic approaches to problem solving, became the basis for the digital revolution. Modern encryption is vastly more sophisticated than Enigma, but the fundamental tension remains the same. Governments and criminals want to communicate secretly. Intelligence agencies want to read those communications. Mathematicians and engineers develop ever more complex encryption systems. Other mathematicians and engineers work to break them. The Enigma story continues in different forms, with quantum encryption, blockchain technologies, and AI-driven cryptanalysis. What made Bletchley Park succeed wasn't just brilliant individuals. It was the way they worked together, the culture of collaboration and obsessive problem-solving. Mathematicians work with linguists. Engineers work with classicists. Chess champions work with crossword enthusiasts. They came from different backgrounds, different classes, different countries, united by the puzzle in front of them and the desperate need to solve it. They worked in secrecy, never receiving public recognition. They couldn't tell their families, couldn't write about their achievements, couldn't even tell other veterans what they'd done. Many of them died before the secret was revealed, their contributions forever anonymous. But they changed history. Every person who worked at Bletchley Park, from Alan Turing designing the bomb to the Wrens operating it to the linguists translating the decrypted messages, contributed to shortening the war. They saved lives, preserved democracy, and helped ensure that Nazi Germany was defeated. The story of breaking Enigma is ultimately a story about human ingenuity. It's about Polish mathematicians who solved what seemed unsolvable. It's about a British genius who thought like a machine before machines could think. It's about thousands of ordinary people doing extraordinary work in absolute secrecy. It's about the power of mathematics, the importance of collaboration, and the difference that intelligence, both human and military, can make. When Arthur Scarbius invented Enigma, he created something he believed was mathematically unbreakable. The odds certainly suggested it was. The sheer number of possible settings made brute force attacks impossible. But he underestimated human creativity. He didn't account for the genius of Rejewski's permutation theory approach, or Turing's logical machines, or the collaborative brilliance of thousands of codebreakers working together. The Enigma codebreakers prove that no system, however complex, is truly unbreakable if brilliant minds are determined enough to break it. They prove that mathematicians can win wars as decisively as generals. And they prove that sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one can talk about, achieved by heroes whose names are never known, working in secret to change the world.